for Chapter 8, Functional Strategies. In Chapter 6, we discuss the corporate or firm level strategy, which is the broad strategic direction for the entire firm or corporation. Here we look at options including growth, stability, and retrenchment. In Chapter 7, we discussed strategy at the business unit level. Each business unit within a corporation, sometimes there's just one, but often more than one, each business unit has a different business strategy. This is also called the competitive strategy. Now, for each business unit, you have different functional areas, such as marketing, finance, production. Each of these functional areas have strategies as well. And that's the topic of Chapter 8. So here we will discuss the importance of consistency among the strategy levels, particularly between the business and functional strategy levels. And we'll talk about common differences in functional strategies between low-cost and differentiated businesses. So the easiest way to explain some of the issues associated with consistency between business and functional level is to use Porter's low-cost differentiated dichotomy. We won't be talking too much about focus or miles and snow a lot in this chapter. The low-cost differentiated dichotomy will help us explain those differences pretty well. So first, functional strategies represent the lowest strategy tier. At this point, you have a business strategy. So in other words, the business unit has developed a competitive strategy, and you expect the functional areas to provide strategies at their levels to support the business strategy. Now, the link between the functional and business strategies is clear in many instances, but not in all instances. You'll see that as we go through this chapter. The business strategy usually dictates what must be done with the various functions. The key here is integrations. All functional strategies must blend together to support the business strategy. So let's start with marketing. We usually think about marketing in terms of the 4 P's: price, promotion, product, and place. Place being distribution. Let's walk through those 4 areas and think in terms of how those functional strategies in each area might be different between low-cost businesses and differentiated businesses. So in terms of pricing, we would expect low-cost businesses to price their products below those of differentiated businesses. In other words, price is less of a concern to a differentiated business because you are producing a product which is distinguished from rivals, and presumably your customers are willing to pay more for that product. Again, we want to distinguish between price and cost. Low-cost businesses produce at a low cost, which means they pay less to produce. They spend less of their resources to produce. Price is what is charged of the customers. From a promotional standpoint, we would expect low-cost businesses to spend less on promotion and often emphasize price when they do. So in other words, low-cost business may not advertise on the Super Bowl. Those are very expensive advertisements. They might use radio spots or low-cost internet advertising of some sort. And then when they do, they emphasize the price, that we have the lowest priced pizza buffet in town. Now, the differentiated businesses highlight the uniqueness of their products or services. So from that standpoint, they're willing to spend more on promotion. They can get it back in price. Well, we just referenced the product, but let's go to that component of the marketing mix. We think about the product or the service. Low-cost businesses emphasize basic, no-frills products. That's essentially the definition of a low-cost strategy. Your differentiated businesses are trying to produce products that are different across the industry. So you would expect them to have products that might not have some of the same features that those of their competitors would have. What about distribution or place? Well, here low-cost businesses tend to seek the most efficient means of distribution, even if it takes a little bit longer time, or the key driver here being the cost of the distribution. Differentiated businesses may emphasize the quality or speed of delivery. And I think in terms of some of the exercise equipment you might see advertised online or on TV infomercials, often it's very expensive and they deliver it to your door. Now they're going to use for this type of product not the most efficient means of distribution, but they are likely to have a truck bring it to your house, and in some cases they assemble it for you and even demonstrate it at some level. Some of the equipment is very much high end. So if you go to buy an exercise bike at a local super center, you're likely to take it home, assemble it, and then hopefully you're able to get it going and use the piece of equipment. That's a very low-cost means of distribution, and you're going to pay a lot less for that piece of equipment. But if you buy one of these exercisers through the infomercials, you're going to spend a lot more. In return, you're going to get a product that's presumably of higher quality, but it's going to be distributed in a way that's much more convenient for you. So these are some of the differences you see with marketing, the marketing function as it relates to the business strategy. In general, the link between the marketing function and the business strategy is very tight. In fact, it's so tight that some of the same language is used in terms of explaining what a low cost or differentiation strategy is. The same language is used there in terms of thinking about marketing. So this brings us to step number 12, defining the market strategy. And here we want to describe the 4 P's of the organization. You want to organize your discussion across the 4 P's: price, promotion, product, and place. And look at some of the recent advertisement that you might see at the company website. Consider how the company prices its products or distributes them. Report on the apparent success or failure of the marketing strategy. Now let's move to finance. In terms of thinking about financial strategies and comparing low-cost and differentiated businesses, low-cost firms tend to minimize the financial costs and often will defer expansion if the cost of capital is too high. Differentiated businesses, again, because they're not as concerned with cost, they tend to fund initiatives associated with quality even if the cost of capital is a little bit higher. Now, the financial ratio analysis is part of evaluating the financial strategy. Table 8.2 in your text summarizes many of the common ratios, and these ratios for most public firms are readily available on the internet. Now, just as a side comment, when you search for them and you look at ratios, sometimes you get different lists, different calculations. That's understood, but the ratios that you see in the table tend to be the ones that you find published online. Well, what are some examples of these ratios here? Well, there are a couple in the liquidity category: your current ratio, the quick ratio or acid test or liquidity test. And considering the current ratio, very common ratio, this indicates how much the current liabilities can be covered by current assets. And typically, you look for a 2-to-1 ratio if possible, but the type of ratio or the desirable ratio that you would see is going to vary from one industry to another. What about activity ratios? Well, one here we'll mention here as an example is that of inventory turnover. Now, inventory turnover is the number of times inventory of finished goods are sold, or an inventory is sold each year. So you would like to turn over your products at a very high rate if possible. You don't like items sitting on the shelves too long. Now, the issue here is, would you take steps to improve your inventory turnover if your ratio is not at the industry level? Maybe it's worse than the industry average. In many cases, you might, but not in all cases. For some businesses, they attract customers because they always have what customers need, even if those products are hard to find and maybe they don't turn over as frequently. So it's good to make the comparison in these ratios, in this case in inventory turnover, but just because you're not performing as well as, say, a competitor or the industry average doesn't mean you're going to take steps to change your business. You also have leverage ratios, things like debt to asset, debt to equity, long-term debt to equity, essentially looking at the profitability in terms of how that relates to assets and equity in your organization. And finally, you have the direct performance ratios, gross profit margin, higher is better, return on assets, equity, and sales. And these are measures of financial performance. So you want to look at these ratios and make comparisons between your business and others in your industry. This takes us to step 13, the financial strategy. Again, here you're identifying the financial strategy, You're looking to see how it seems to fit with the business strategy. And you also look at how the organization is performing in a broad sense. And ratio analysis can help us do that. So what you want to do is provide a chart that includes the ratios for your company as well as industry averages. Now, a couple of practical considerations. What if you can't locate the industry averages for your particular industry as you've defined it? Perhaps you've defined your industry in a way that's a little different from the way others have done so online. So even if you can locate industry averages, it's not a direct comparison. Well, you have a few options. If you want to use the industry comparisons because the industry definition is fairly close, you can do that, but you should note there's a difference. Alternatively, you can just do comparisons between your company and several of the major competitors. So let's give you an example. We always talk about McDonald's in terms of any of the examples, so let's develop that one here. Let's say you're doing a case study for McDonald's, and you've defined McDonald's in a fast food industry, and let's just assume that the ratios that you see online for the industry are for all restaurants, not just fast food. That's a little bit of a different industry definition. Would it be valid to compare McDonald's ratios as a fast food restaurant to the averages for the entire restaurant industry? I would say it's likely a valid comparison, but it might be a little bit different because fast food restaurants operate differently than other types of restaurants. So if you make that comparison, you want to note that the industry definition that's being used here is different from the one that you used in your case analysis. Alternatively, or in addition, you can compare McDonald's to Burger King, maybe a Chick-fil-A or some other businesses if you're able to obtain those ratios and do some direct comparisons that way as well. The key here is to explain the substantial differences between the ratios for your firm and those for the industry averages or your rivals. And when I say explain, I don't mean say that your firm has an asset task ratio of 2.3 and a competitor is 2.7. That's not explaining. That's just showing a calculation. You want to get behind the numbers where there are significant differences and explain what's going on in those ratios to produce that type of difference. So let's shift and talk about the production function. And this would be called the production strategy or the service strategy in service organizations. There are a couple of concepts we have to consider when we define the production strategy. The first is that of the experience curve. Now, this is the reduction in per unit costs that occur as an organization grows. The reductions can come through organizational learning, economies of scale, or capital labor substitution. So there are three ways that the experience curve is leveraged. Now, organizations learn when employees become more efficient when they perform the same task many times. So simply doing something for a long period of time should make you better at it. So there's a certain amount of learning that occurs. Economies of scale takes effect because you're producing a lot of product, and by doing so, you're able to reduce the per unit cost of production. Capital labor substitution refers to an organization's ability to substitute labor for capital or vice versa. What that means is, if we take, say, McDonald's as an example or other fast food restaurants, many of them are beginning to introduce kiosks as a way of making orders, or you can order online before you show up. Well, in doing so, what they're essentially is happening here is they're replacing the individuals required to take the order with technology, be it a kiosk or a smartphone. Now, there are different reasons why you might want to do that. It could be more convenient for consumers, but one thing it does is it lowers costs in a way. Because once you've installed the equipment, the individual can walk in, tap in the order at the kiosk, or provide the order online, and you don't have to pay a worker to take the order. So what that's doing is substituting capital for the labor. You can go back and forth. This is something you can do as you grow and you figure out what the best way to allocate your resources might be. Now, low-cost businesses emphasize cost reductions through the experience curve. It's a big thing for them. The idea is to hopefully produce a lot of product, get better at it, and choose the capital labor combinations that keep production costs really low. And what they want to do is eliminate operations that are unnecessary and add little value, if any, to the final product. But there's also a quality side of this as well. Now, historically, quality was a control activity that occurred at the end. The idea is when the product comes off the assembly line, you check it and see if it's any good, and if it's not, you remove it. But starting in the 1980s, we had what was called a total quality or TQM movement, and this changed the perspective on quality. And ever since that time, we started to look at quality as something that occurs at every step along the way. So from a traditional assembly line perspective, any worker can stop the line, presumably, if they see a quality problem. They should have that ability to do that. From a service perspective, if you're delivering a service, if you're even a cashier at a restaurant or at a department store, if you see something that's not done correctly, you shouldn't just continue doing it because it's part of the procedure. You should be able to stop it and say the quality's not right here. So quality is really important to all businesses. Now, we can ask the basic question, is quality equally important to low-cost businesses and to differentiated businesses? And the answer is kind of a qualified no. But quality is important to all companies. Okay, let's again use restaurants as an example. If you're a pizza restaurant, if you can provide all the pizza you want to eat for $2, okay, a $2 pizza buffet, that would really be cheap and might attract a lot of customers. But if your pizza tastes awful, it doesn't matter how cheap it is, nobody's going to buy it. Now, there was a car company that came out years ago. In fact, it existed long before then. This was the Yugo. It was a company from Eastern Europe. And the Yugo was introduced in the United States. And the original advertising thing was everyone needs a Yugo sometime. The idea being that it's a really cheap car. There's a point where you might want to buy a cheap new car. And it was cheap. It was $29.95. This was a very inexpensive new car introduced in the U.S. The problem was that the quality was so poor that even though it was cheap, it was not reliable. So you couldn't get it repaired, easily with the type of technology used. Parts were hard to get. It was just difficult to keep the car running for a period of time. So the moral of the story is it doesn't matter how cheap your new car is. If it doesn't run reliably, all it is a liability from the standpoint of the customer. So yes, quality is more important from a differentiated perspective, but even low-cost businesses have to be able to produce their products or services at a base level of quality. What about research and development? Well, product and service R&D refers to efforts directed towards improvements or innovations in the quality or uniqueness of a company's outputs. So here you would see that differentiated businesses are more likely to invest in product service R&D because they want to produce differentiated products and services. Process R&D is designed to reduce the operational costs and improve efficiency. So process R&D represents investments in lowering the per unit cost of producing a product or service. Differentiators usually invest more in product service R&D, whereas cost leaders invest more in process R&D. Now, it is true your differentiators are likely to spend more overall in R&D, but it's also an issue in terms of what type of research and development. Again, for differentiators, more likely to be investing in the product service R&D, and the cost leaders more likely to be investing in the process R&D. What about the purchasing function? Well, low-cost businesses procure supplies and raw materials at the lowest possible price, again, price from what they pay, being what they pay suppliers, as long as it's consistent with a basic quality standard. So if you're building a car and the idea is to produce the lowest cost vehicle that you can, if you can purchase tires from say a manufacturer that gives you a decent tire, it's okay, but it's the cheapest, that's likely to be the tire you're going to put on your vehicle. A differentiated business, on the other hand, may be willing to pay more for raw materials if they help differentiate the final product or service. So if you're selling a Lexus vehicle, you're probably not going to put the cheapest tire you can on the car. You're going to try to buy a high-end tire, rather, a name brand tire, and put that on your new vehicles, because that can help you differentiate your vehicles from some of the others in the industry. Now, just-in-time inventory management has grown a lot during the past few decades, and that's often associated with both low-cost and differentiated businesses. This is an example of one of those tools that makes sense in both regards. It does drive your cost down, but it can also be a tool that is effective for other businesses as well. This brings us to step number 14, production and purchasing strategies. And here you want to identify the production and purchasing strategies for the company. Now, these are two different areas. They're related, but they're just clustered together here in this step. These distinct areas should be addressed individually. And your questions you're asking here is, how do these strategies differ from those of the closest competitors? Now, we've been able to identify some differences in production and purchasing strategies, or what should be differences based on low cost versus differentiation as a business strategy, but this doesn't mean that these differences are absolute. Well, let's turn our attention to human resources. How might we see some differences between low cost and differentiated businesses here? Well, low cost businesses may attempt to minimize HR expenses, things like staffing, training, development, and even salaries. But here's the problem. If you minimize those expenses to a degree that's too extensive, you can actually end up increasing costs in other areas. In many instances, it's necessary to pay market wages for quality people. So even if you have a deep discount retailer, if you hire somebody to manage that retailer at 1/3 of the going rate, you're likely to get a poor quality manager, and you may have all sorts of other problems in your store that could cost you more than it would cost you if you just paid the manager a market wage. So the problem here is, even though low-cost businesses want to keep expenses low, you still have to pay people what you need to pay them in order to get good quality HR support. Now, there's a whole notion of knowledge and competitive advantage, which is really interesting, and it's a philosophical view of the value of human resources. And here's the idea. When employees are viewed as expenses, organizations tend to minimize their costs. When they're viewed as investments, the organization tends to maximize the value. And this shift in focus changes the way companies look at human capital. Now, human capital is the sum of capabilities of individuals in an organization, and it's a source of competitive advantage. If you have really good people that bring something to the table that your rivals don't have, then that can allow you to do something that others in the industry cannot do. Now, according to what we call a knowledge management perspective, the people and their skills and abilities represent the only source of competitive advantage that cannot be reproduced by competitors. So this underscores the importance, the value of human resources in developing long-term competitive or sustainable competitive advantage. Well, let's close our discussion on different functions by looking at information systems. And here we ask that same question: would we see a different information system strategy typically at a low-cost business versus a differentiated business? If we think through this issue, our low-cost businesses might be inclined to spend less on an information system than a differentiated company, willing to spend more perhaps. But you still need to be able to make effective decisions in all organizations, regardless of the strategy. So a computer-based decision support system can permit each functional area to access the information it needs to make quality decisions, and you need to be able to make these quality decisions at all types of businesses. This is important regardless of strategy. So it's not clear, the relationship between the information systems strategy and the business strategy is not as clear as it is, say, in other areas like marketing. What about functional strategies and the industry lifecycle? Are some functional strategies just more important at different stages of the industry lifecycle? Well, there tends to be a relationship here, and it's intuitive. In the introduction stage, a lot of companies emphasize R&D because they're trying to develop the products and services necessary to meet the needs of a new industry. When the stage advances to growth, often the emphasis is on marketing, just getting the word out. We've got the products, we've got the services, come buy from us. But as the industry moves into maturity, the emphasis often shifts to production. At this point, it's about production efficiency, standardizing processes, and meeting certain quality baselines. When you shift into the decline stage, the emphasis often shifts as well to finance, because at this point, you're sometimes just managing decline, managing financial losses, and determining how to move the pieces of the business around in a way that make financial sense. Now, the HR function is one that I didn't mention through these 4 areas. It's really important, but it's not dominant in all areas. HR, human resources are important throughout the entire industry life cycle. Well, this brings us to step 15. And in this step, we look at the functional strategies in the areas we haven't addressed in the previous steps in this chapter. Things like human resources and information systems. And perhaps you have another function that you think is relevant to discuss for your organization. As with the previous areas, you want to emphasize the differences between your organization and your competitors. Well, this concludes the audio commentary for this chapter.